I am currently writing a monograph on the ways ritual performance served as a means of exorcising basic consuming human fears, and what follows is a brief summary of parts of the 3 core chapters in the book. This is work in progress, so any input will be greatly appreciated. I will not focus here on every aspect of these festivals. I do not have the time. I will instead present the fears each of these festivals targeted and the way these fears were exorcised. This phenomenological investigation, as you're about to find out, draws heavily from the work of psychologists and psychoanalysts. Also, the rituals are examined primarily from an emic perspective, in other words, from the perspective of the participants, so that their role in the lives of these individuals can be identified. Psychoanalysis was the last of the social disciplines to develop because the need for it appears to have arisen late in human history. Carl Jung wrote that, quote, "Anyone who falls down from the roof or ceiling of the Christian cathedral falls into himself," end quote. This is when the need for self-reflection and psychoanalysis arises. By this he meant that when man stopped believing that God will help him, he was forced to deal with his problems and fears himself, and found out that he could not, and that he needed professional help. I do not fully agree with Jung, because I do not think that it is belief in God that modern man has lost, but its bodily expression through ritual performance. In other words, the bodily expression of fears and hopes, and the bodily knowledge that a divine being is present, understands, and is empathetic enough to intervene and offer assistance. Phobos, the Greek personification of fear, was the son of Aphrodite and Ares. The ancient sources connect him primarily with war, and by extension, the fear of loss and dying, since according to Hesiod and Homer, he accompanied his father to the battlefield. He was dauntless and inspired fear even to the bravest. Nevertheless, he was also son of Aphrodite, so he is sometimes described and depicted as having a fearful beauty that made him almost impossible not to look at. He was in his own way irresistible. Sextus Empiricus and the comic fragment offer another description of Phobos. They call him amorphotatos, which means one without a form, a tricky, indeterminate presence that cannot be straightforwardly seen and by extension dealt with. This epithet, amorphotatos, was the first thing that came to my mind when I saw the sculpture of Anna Chromi that features on the poster of this lecture and whose title is Di Pietà. It's in a square in Salzburg, and she made it in 1999. So it's called Di Pietà, but when I look at it, I see Sextus Empiricus's Amorphotatos Phobos. From a psychoanalytical point of view, there could not be better descriptions of the emotion of fear. It is almost unavoidable and bends even the bravest. Once experienced, it is never quite eradicated. It keeps lurking in the shadows. My research examines a way this emotion, whose complexity was known in antiquity, was controlled in classical Athens. When a girl in classical Athens got married, around the age of 14 and after menarche, she moved to her husband's house and lived with him, her in-laws, her husband's siblings, if they were unmarried, and possibly his brother's wife. Her husband was much older than her, some 15 years older than her, was not chosen by her, and in numerous cases was a complete stranger to her prior to the wedding. After getting married, the 14-year-old was taken away from her home, her mother, and sometimes even her deme to an unknown household. In this new environment, she could not take with her her most familiar and comforting belongings, like her dolls and other toys, which she had dedicated to Artemis prior to getting married. She may not have taken with her her favorite dress, which she might have also given to Artemis. Her personal belongings, as these were set by Solon, consisted of up to 3 outfits and little else. In the new household, she was expected to weave, cook, and do house chores under the supervision of her mother-in-law. Most importantly, she was expected to bear children and raise them properly. This was her purpose in life, in a similar manner to her husband's purpose, which was going to war and defending Athens. Childbearing was the main way for her to earn the respect of her husband and be acknowledged as a useful member of her new household. Childbirth was as scary, dangerous, and painful for women as was man-to-man combat for men. The death rate for women giving birth has been calculated between 10 to 20%. That's 1 in 5 women died. Whilst up to 30 to 40% of the infants would not live longer than a year. If the infant died and the mother had survived, she needed to get pregnant and give another birth as soon as possible, despite the emotional trauma she had sustained and possibly the physical trauma of childbirth. This was the way she could prove her worth. Thus, around the age of 12, a child had to cope with her body changing as a result of puberty and coming to terms with the fact that soon her entire life would change completely, and on top of all this, that she would soon have to go through labor. This was how she would transcend to adulthood, married life, and motherhood. Understandably, the child and subsequent maiden was afraid. So much so that she could suffer from a popular folk illness, the wandering womb syndrome. Hippocrates wrote that she would be in pain, get a fever, be hungry and thirsty, and act as if she was insane. Some of these symptoms are somatized expressions of maidens' fear of change and growing up. Nowadays, approximately 90 to 95% of anorexia nervosa patients are women between the ages of 12 and 25. They develop this potentially fatal eating disorder as a response to their bodies changing in puberty and/or as a reaction to sexual maturity and to the traditional roles women are expected to play. Starvation results in the cessation of menstruation, amenorrhea, and the bodies of the patients become slim like those of sexually immature girls. As such, anorexia nervosa is another somatized reaction to change and growing up, being faced with the possibility of married life and motherhood. Cases of anorexia nervosa have increased rapidly since the 60s, and since the late 70s, they reached epidemic proportions in Europe and North America. This relatively new folk illness, according to psychologists, psychoanalysts, and psychoanalytic feminists, is a modern, Western, middle and upper class response to transcending to womanhood. The women use anorexia nervosa as a way of asserting their convictions. This is a quote from Malson, a psychoanalytic feminist. Quote, "The anorexic woman parodies deeply embedded gender ideologies that devalue women. She makes permanent war with phallocentrism and patriarchy." End quote. No wonder why the cure rate for anorexia nervosa of the best, not the average, the best practitioners, is 40 to 60%. So half of these cases remain uncured. After all, this is a permanent war against phallocentrism. This is the cure rate for women's somatized fears and resistance to growing up and/or patriarchy at the age of feminism, epidurals, psychoanalysts, and of course cesarean sections, when most Western women can choose their husbands or simply choose not to get married or have children without consequences because these are socially acceptable choices. The cure for anorexia nervosa consists primarily of psychotherapy, where women are asked to pinpoint and verbalize where their fears and problems lie so that they will become able to manage them. Hospitalization and vitamin supplements are ways of dealing with the symptoms of anorexia nervosa and ensuring that the patient will not perish of starvation. The actual cure is talking about it, and as aforementioned, it fails half the time. How did girls in classical Athens manage to overcome their fear of much more ominous changes than the ones faced now? In antiquity, the symptoms of the wandering womb were treated with fumigation. An actual cure, however, is nowhere to be found in the Hippocratic texts. The doctors simply advised a quick marriage so that the patients would become sexually active and bear children. So even though some maidens were afraid of sexual maturity, occasionally to the extent of somatizing this fear, they would nevertheless quickly move on to the next stage in their lives and become functional members of their new households. How was their fear managed or eradicated so fast and effectively, and why is this information nowhere to be found in the ancient sources? In my opinion, the reason the girls could overcome their fear so effectively was that instead of hoarding it inside or being forced to rationalize and verbalize it so that amongst others somebody could write it down, they danced it away in a ritual context in the rite of passage to womanhood that was the Arctia. In a sanctuary and under the protective eye of Artemis, the girls performed in the Arctia a cathartic, empowering masked dance. Sealed from prying eyes, especially men's, they wore a bear disguise, ran and danced erratically, and embodied some of the archetypes their patron goddess stood for: the power of nature, the wild and untamed, the socially divergent. Because of the age of the participants, who would have been around 12, the fact that they would dress as bears would be perceived by them as a form of play. This is not to downplay the fact that this was a serious religious performance, and via the disguise, the participants would actually become bears. It is simply another layer of meaning which coexisted and was simultaneously perceived along with the transformation by the participants. This is an extra from Winnicott, a famous British psychoanalyst, student of Freud, who corrected Freud on many mistakes. So, quote, "Playing facilitates growth and therefore health. Playing leads into group relationships and is a way for one to be creative." And then Winnicott stresses that, quote, "It is only in being creative that the individual discovers the self," end quote. Thus, the girls' masked dance did not only empower them, but also allowed them insights into their selves, their potential, their abilities. Once they embodied Artemis's powers, as well as their own, via their bear disguise, they shed away their saffron-colored robes and raced in the nude. Thus, after growing comfortable in their bear skin, they grew comfortable in their own skin and would continue to feel comfortable in it when their bodies changed in puberty and during pregnancy. It appears that the Athenians knew, possibly without knowing, that fear cannot be effectively discharged from the mouth in the form of words. It is instead exuded from the skin in the form of sweat. It can be danced and sweated away and then shed, like the girls used saffron-colored robes. The Arctia was a religious ritual that aimed, amongst others, at exorcising young girls' fear of change. It empowered them and made them feel confident enough that whatever fear it was they were facing, whether it was vague and hard to verbalize, or concrete and identifiable, they were strong enough to tame it and prevent it from defining their future lives. Moreover, since they had temporarily embodied Artemis's powers and transformed into Artemis's sacred animals, they knew that they would permanently be under the protection of a present, almost tangible, powerful goddess. Apart from fear of change, another perennial fear is that of loss, especially of a loved one. A lot has been written by psychologists on loss and grief and on our current inability to mourn and thus get over a loss. In classical Athens, there was a religious festival, the Adonia, that involved loving, losing, and mourning. For the Adonia, women in Athens would wear their best dresses and jewelry, take with them homemade pots with plants, and gather in groups on the roofs of houses. After beautifying the roofs with their plants, they would celebrate Aphrodite's and Adonis's love for each other. They would consume alcohol and hold a panichis, an all-night dance. This dance was similar to the Arctia mask dance, because the women, via the panichis, the intoxication, and their ornate attires, would convert into Aphrodite's and embody her divine powers in the manner of the little girls embodying Artemis's powers. As Aphrodite's, the dancers would experience the intensity of Aphrodite's love for Adonis, but also enjoy receiving the love and attention that Aphrodite received from him. After this, they would mourn for the premature death of Adonis, their beloved one, place Adonis figurines on funeral biers, hold ekphoras, funeral processions, around Athens, and finally go home to their lives. Their mourning was intense and loud, involving wailing and crying from rooftops. This religious ritual offered women the opportunity to learn how to deal with loss. By becoming Aphrodite's, they experienced Aphrodite's acute bereavement for the death of Adonis, but they also partook in her divine ability to deal with it. Thus, this religious performance, which was in part preparation for losing someone, ensured that women would not be consumed by their fear of loss when their sons, brothers, fathers, and husbands went to war. And this happened every year. They saw them off to war every year. Also, in the case that these loved ones died prematurely or unexpectedly, and not necessarily in battle, the women would know how to grieve for them, and through the process of mourning, get over their losses and continue to be functional members of their households and communities. As aforementioned, if they lost a child, they needed to bear another one as fast as possible. There was no time to fall apart. And let me remind you Pericles' oration, where he tells the mothers that have just lost their sons in the early years of the Peloponnesian War, now don't cry, go back home and make more children, because Athens needs them. Moreover, on the unconscious level, dealing with Adonis's death offered them a kind of reassurance. Freud supported that, quote, "There is a link between the death of the other and one's own death or survival. In contexts of rivalry, and also in general, the death of the other often has the unconscious significance of outliving him and serves as proof of narcissistic victory." End quote. And this is what many psychoanalysts see behind, quote, "a normal interest in fatal accidents and execution," end quote. This may appear too cynical at first. Nevertheless, in the context of 5th century Athens, this was largely the case. In my opinion, it still is. But fortunately, I do not have to argue for that. Rivalry and narcissistic victory were the driving forces behind most of Athenians' decisions. Powerful political figures and public figures were popularly ostracized or executed. Enemies of the state and criminals were tortured in the center of Athens, and their corpses were left to rot in plain sight and smell as a warning. People were nailed on planks and left to die of exhaustion, infection, pain, and thirst, while passers-by, the average Athenian, ridiculed and stoned them, even though they already were at death's door. This excavation that you see by Keramopoulos, the one that shows the Apotympanismos, the skulls of the people that were excavated were smashed, because whilst they were hanging on their plants, they would throw stones in their face and smash their skulls. That's in the archaeological record. These were some of the measures taken to ensure social order and political stability. If we add to this man-to-man combat, where kill or be killed is what this type of combat is really about, the way the Athenians treated islanders, because they could and wanted everyone to know this, and overly ambitious failed campaigns abroad, because Athenian narcissism inevitably led to errors in judgment, it becomes apparent that the demise of the other gave Athenians some sort of reassurance. In the context of the Adonia, Adonis was the participants' loved one. They were Aphrodite's, and he was their great love. At the same time, and on another level, he was not really theirs, because they were not really Aphrodite's. He was the other to their loved ones, who they were afraid of losing when they saw them off to war every year or wasting away from an illness. As another, Adonis's death had the significance of their sons, brothers, fathers, etc., outliving him. Adonis died as a substitute so that their son could live. They mourned for Adonis, so they may not have to mourn for another one anytime soon. Death was placated. They might just get away without suffering another loss. It is possible that women would also perceive their mourning for Adonis as a preventive measure against losing someone in their household. This might have even been one of the unconscious causes for celebration in the Adonia. The women were happy because they loved and were loved by Adonis, and also because it was going to be Adonis this time, as opposed to their relatives that died. Quite the narcissistic victory, and over no one less than a goddess. Apart from this, mourning in the Adonia was a means of alleviating residual grief from those who had already lost someone, including those who were never offered the chance to bury their loved ones, since they were presented with an urn instead of a body. These women would get some closure through preparing the Adonis figurine for burial. Psychoanalysts have written extensively on the psychological effects of having to grieve for an absence as opposed to over a corpse. A dead person whose body has not been retrieved or identified despite the evidence pointing to his death can be easily perceived by those closest to him as missing instead of dead. The hope that he may be alive and return to them sometime in the future torments them and prevents the commencement of the work of mourning. Those closest to the dead person experience it as their moral obligation to hold on to the hope of his return. They fear that if they give up hoping, they will be themselves responsible for his death. As a result, they do not move on with their lives. This would be unacceptable in classical Athens because it was impractical, and the Adonia assisted in preventing this from happening. And now we'll turn to the Adonis dolls and the women's attires. In this religious ritual too, like in the Arctia, there was play involved, specifically dress-up, dancing, and handling dolls. Since this ritual too targeted fear, play as a way to encourage creativity and self-reflection was necessary. This would allow the participants to express and release their fear through bodily movement, their drunken dances, and the handling and parading of the dolls. It also assisted them in becoming Aphrodites, and thus perceiving this goddess as another almost tangible presence who understood and would offer assistance when the need arose. Excuse me. Apart from fear of loss and residual grief, in my opinion, the Adonia alleviated yet another fear, that of lovelessness. As aforementioned, women in classical Athens did not get to pick their husbands, and it is possible that A, some of them would never subsequently love them, B, some of them were afraid of the prospect of living loveless lives. To mention one example, in the case of death of her father, and provided that there was no male heir in the family, it was up to the daughter to preserve the family's property. Since she could not own it herself, she would be quickly married off to one of her father's siblings so that the property would stay in the family. Her oldest uncle was the first choice, but in reality, starting from him, she would be married off to whichever uncle was single. She knew this was a possibility every time she saw her father off to war. Was this girl afraid of her prospects? Possibly. Nevertheless, she would still do what she had to do. Would this girl and subsequent woman married off to her old uncle ever experience romantic love? Possibly. But in any case, there was the Adonia festival. In this festival, whether unmarried or already married off, the scared or concerned girl could fall in love with Adonis and be loved by him with the intensity that Aphrodite herself was loved. This ritual would have thus filled a gap in some of the participants' lives by offering them a chance to experience what they feared they might never experience. And this would have been another cause for the intense crying and wailing. For some women, Adonis would have been their one and only loved one, and as soon as they found him, they had to bury him. The most omnipresent fear, though, and one that is known to give rise to religiosity, is fear of death. Most religions offer instructions on attaining happiness in the afterlife. In addition, most prayers and votive offerings aim at keeping death away. For example, offerings to Asclepius for one's health to be restored, so that they will not eventually die. Prayers and sacrifices to a variety of major and minor deities for ships to reach harbor safely, so that the mariners will not die, etc. All of these measures offer reassurance that the gods are placated and that death may be at least temporarily evaded. Even so, fear of death is not expelled with such methods because it is not directly confronted. When one fears death, in essence, one fears something that has not been experienced firsthand. The most effective way, according to Winnicott, for any fear of this type to be handled and prevented from turning into a phobia is for the fear to be experienced in the present, as opposed to remaining imagined. A ritual context is the most appropriate context for one to die without permanently dying, and thus directly confront and alleviate fear of death. Freud believed a similar thing, since he wrote that one of the most frightening aspects of death is our ignorance of what it entails. Quote, "What is death? What kind of state is it? What does it make of us?" End quote. Additionally, according to Freud and Razinski, what we fear most about death is its arbitrariness and externality, i.e. the fact that it is something beyond our control. We do not know where, when, and how we will die. In a ritual context, this arbitrariness is controlled. One knows at least where and why one has to die. As such, this context is appropriate for one to confront and overcome one's fear of death. In classical Athens, it was the Eleusinian mysteries that offered the opportunity for such direct confrontation. The foundation myth for this festival was the kidnapping of Persephone by Hades, god of the underworld, and Demeter's search and mourning for her daughter, who was eventually returned to her after Zeus's mediation. Persephone would spend 2/3 of the year with her mother, and the remaining third she would return to her husband in the underworld. One of the rites in the mysteries was a reenactment of the search for Persephone. The participants, the Miste, would conduct this search at night with blindfolds, possibly with some dancing moves involved, and with the sound of an ominous gong and an invocation for Persephone to appear. This search was experienced by them as a search in the underworld. For the purposes of the reenactment, the Miste were dead and wandering in the unknown, scared and exhausted. They would be uncertain about how to maneuver themselves, where to go, and what was happening around them. Their sense of sight was taken away from them. In my opinion, they would have also not been allowed to talk, since they were dead, and because a single joke would ruin this religious experience. They could only listen to the gong to possibly roughly orientate themselves, and any noises like footsteps which might have offered them a clue as to whether they were about to bump into another mystis. Through this bodily pathos, they would acquire bodily knowledge of the underworld. After going through this, they would be guided to the beautifully lit telesterion, take off their blindfolds, Persephone would have been found, and they would again return to the world of the living. The purpose of this ritual performance, inter alia, was giving in to death so as to overcome the fear of it. The lure for the initiates to go through this pathos was that they would no longer have something to fear. They had embodied Demeter's dread for the loss of her daughter, assisted her by dying and searching themselves for her daughter in the darkness of the underworld, and finally encountered Persephone, the queen of the dead. Their empathy, efforts, and acquaintance with Kori would be rewarded with a happy afterlife. It would be the uninitiated who would have to wander scared and lost in the dark after death. The Miste had already done this, learned how to be in the darkness, and whilst at it had earned Persephone's gratitude, so they could rest assured that their afterlife would comprise mostly of dancing in meadows, as opposed to being lost in the dark. What is, in my opinion, truly fascinating about this ritual is the fact that if one wanted to be really sure that it worked, certain that she would not have to suffer in the afterlife, and by extension continue being afraid of dying, she had to participate twice in the Eleusinian mysteries and experience this part of the festival, the wandering in the underworld, in two distinctly different ways. The first time, she was a mystis, so she did not know in advance what was to happen exactly. One's eyes would be tied, and one had to wander disoriented and lost in the underworld until they were told that Persephone is now found, and be guided in the telesterion to remove the blindfold. The second time, this person was no longer a mystis, because they had already completed their initiation, and were therefore elevated to the status of the epopte, the ones that see. That's what epopte means. So the second time they participated, they no longer had to wear blindfolds. The ritual took place in the dark, but as we all know, after a while, our eyes get accustomed to the dark, and we may not be able to see perfectly, but we can see enough. Moreover, it is possible that the epopte were holding torches, so they might have been able to see quite well. In this state of not seeing, knowing perfectly, But seeing, knowing more than most, and certainly more than the blindfolded Miste, they supervised these Miste. They watched them moving around the sanctuary scared, listened to their fear, expressed by heavy breathing, sighs, or possibly a scream or two when they would inevitably bump into something painful. They thus got a taste of how the underworld would be for them, who already knew. They would be in control, the lack of which, as aforementioned, is what is scariest about death, according to Freud. They would know how to move and where to go so as to reach the sunny meadows. And they would watch from a position of knowledge the uninitiated who were doomed to wander aimlessly in ignorance, in the mud, and suffer trapped in perpetual uncertainty and fear. Another narcissistic victory. So the first time they participated in the ritual, they got over the basic human fear of death. The second time, they got to learn what death really entails, what it was they were afraid of in the first place and would no longer have to go through in the afterlife. Death was thus deconstructed. It was no longer unknown and arbitrary, and it did not entail loss of control. All of these were accomplished by another game, something between searching for the piñata/Persephone and blind man's buff. Throughout, Demeter was with them, since they embodied her desperation and agony, and at the end, Persephone would have been found, and one can only find what exists. Once more, a bodily knowledge was acquired that two powerful goddesses were on their side and would assist when they needed them. Rank supported that what makes us fear death the most is the fact that upon dying, we lose our individuality, our traits, the characteristics that makes us persons. Indeed, if the afterlife entailed aimless wandering in the dark and the mud, it clearly stripped the dead of their individualities. They were all in the same state of desperation, where traits and characteristics would neither be of use to them nor discernible to those around them. Those, however, in the sunny meadows would continue to be happy, would be able to see and interact with others, and thus remain individuals. Consequently, one of the unspoken promises of the Eleusinian mysteries was that the initiated would continue to be themselves after death. They would remain persons. Maintaining one's individuality was, in my opinion, very important in classical Athens, a top priority. Robin Osborne, in his 2018 book, The Transformation of Athens, presents important changes in Athenian iconography that take place in the middle of the 5th century. He shows how there is a shift. Now, this is a very long quote, but it comes from various places in the book. This isn't a single sentence. So there is a shift, quote, from a focus on performance and success to a focus on the person who will perform and might achieve the success. A transformation from an emphasis on achievement to an emphasis on attitude, from encouraging the revisiting of what has happened in the past to encouraging a focus on how to prepare for what might be achieved in the future. There is an emphasis on the right to privacy and to living scope for the imagination. And he remarks that in earlier imagery, rituals are instrumental. They are resources to be exploited to further other aspects of one's life. And in my opinion, he means public life, to prove that one is a member of the community. Back to Osborne. In the later imagery, the ritual is not a means, but an end in itself. It is participation in ritual that matters, end quote. These changes do not concern pottery iconography only. They reflect major changes in the way Athenians thought of themselves. Gradually, Athenians realized that they are individuals, that each has distinctive traits, aspirations, ambitions, and fears, and most importantly, rights. to pursue these aspirations, to be free of these fears. Winnicott, inspired by Freud, supported that, quote, men and women of early times identified themselves with the community and with nature and with unexplained phenomena such as the rising and setting of the sun. I think he should have replaced his ends with ends/ors. In any case, he shows that individuality did not always exist and is not to be taken for granted. Freud supported that individuality appeared with the rise of monotheism. I fully agree with him that individuality is not something that one necessarily possesses. One has to accomplish the discovery of the self. And in order to do so, one needs to have the time and space to reflect. I disagree that monotheism was what was needed for one to accomplish this. I believe that 5th century Athenians were a society of individuals. As individuals, their concerns and aspirations changed. There was a turn to esotericism, to self-reflection. This was the time that unique fears took shape. If the maiden is an individual, she feels that she has the right to love, and thus fears the prospect of a loveless life. Similarly, the individual who invested time and energy to understand what it is that makes him/her different to one's friends and neighbors is afraid to die and go back to being a non-person. This is the time when ritual performance acquired unique significance. Through these performances, individuals were able to confront these emerging, pressing fears and alleviate them. And it is during this time, from the middle of the 5th century onwards, that the Athenians started investing thought and funds into transforming long-established sanctuaries in ways that made these sanctuaries ideal places to house emotionally laden rituals, to which one did not participate just to show that they are a member of a community, but because they needed and wanted to. This was also the time that new festivals aiming at expression of emotions were introduced, like the Adonia. Returning to the 3 festivals I examined, I hope to have shown in this talk how the efficacy of ritual performance rested on the bodily expression of emotions that cannot be properly expressed verbally. This form of expression of basic human fears, which was accepted and encouraged in a ritual context, ensured the subsequent adequate management of these fears by the festival participants. Ritual performance thus prevented fears from turning into phobias and assisted the participants in leading emotionally healthy lives without the help of psychoanalysts. The latter's role was replaced by the gods, who were present during these performances, whose powers or emotions the participants embodied, and who became intimate presences in the lives of the performance that would guide and assist them when the need arose. Thank you.